With great data comes even greater access latency. Welcome to the Trino community broadcast, where we transform your latency woes into fast insights. I'm your host, Brian Olson.
And I'm the co-host, Manfred Moser, as usual.
Trino Community Broadcast is a show where we cover events and happenings in the open source Now Trino community and show off some cool stuff about Now Trino, formerly Presto SQL. Manfred, you want to take it off with some intros for our honored guests today?
Yeah, sure. So we have a very special episode today because, as some of you hopefully noticed, we have a big event over the new year and into this 2021, starting it all fresh, renaming our Presto SQL project to Trino. And we want to find out more from the main gang of maintainers and founders of the project. So we have all four of them ready here with us today. There's Martin, Dain, David, and Eric joining us today. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to go through a little quick of an introduction where each one of them will tell us a bit about their Trino involvement, especially in the code base maybe, and maybe something other tidbits that might be fun as a quick first start. So how about Martin, you want to take it away first?
All right. Thanks, Manfred, and hi, Brian. It's great to be here again.
Yes.
All right, so I've been involved in Trino, formerly Presto SQL, since the beginning. We started back in 2012, and one interesting thing is I actually knew Dain and David from before we started the project. We've known each other for a few years. We worked at a couple of companies together. Lately, I've actually been involved in all sorts of parts in the code base. Lately, over the past few years, mostly around anything having to do with the language, the parser, analyzer, optimizer, some parts of the execution engine, and in some cases, even some connectors. Like, for example, I worked on the Elasticsearch connector last year. I spent a couple of weeks working on that. Let's see, on the kind of personal side, I guess you probably, if you haven't noticed from my accent, I'm from Argentina. So if there's anyone from Argentina here, hola.
Awesome.
And I have a bunch of hobbies. If you're into photography or airplanes, I'd like to chat with you at some point. Those are.
Yeah, Martin, is your picture? It looks like you're like wearing some sort of a face mask on GitHub and things like that. So where's that picture from?
Oh, that was a ski trip in Tahoe. It was a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Took a selfie. I liked how it looked, and then you just stuck there.
Yeah, I thought maybe it was a plane, because I know at some point I just heard randomly like you were into planes, and so I thought maybe that was like you on a plane or something like that. So,
well, that would have to be like a military fighter pilot or something. Wearing like
I don't know what connections you have, man.
I think the airplanes he's flying are not remote control airplanes. They're real airplanes, but they're a bit slower than jets, probably.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. So, Martin, the other thing I also, of course, know is that you're a bit of an outward-facing person for the project quite a bit, working with lots of companies and stuff like that. And we also worked on the book together. So it's also very good to know that you're a lot of having your fingers a lot of that kind of stuff. So that's excellent.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, Dain, you want to go next? You are muted, by the way, so maybe you're not going to...
just figured that out, obviously.
Happens all the time. I make that mistake.
Number one quote of 2020 is, "Hey, you're on mute."
As it still happens in 2021.
Yeah.
Didn't change anything.
So I've been involved with Presto SQL, then Trino since the beginning, since before it even had a name. As Martin mentioned, I've worked with David and Martin at Proofpoint and Ning, so we've been working together for a really long time. So I mostly work on in Trino. I mostly work on the execution engine and performance related stuff, kind of all the way down to the bits. So I wrote the orc reader, and that's from scratch. So like do a lot of stuff all the way down to the bits, making sure like our stuff plays well in the JVM. all that sort of like compiler tech and things like that. But not the language. That's actually really hard. So that I leave for Marty.
Are you kidding me? Like really hard? Like when we were talking in the security training, you were talking about debugging all the way down into JVM. I mean, that is definitely hard. So you don't have to be so modest.
Yeah.
Also, what I want to mention is you've been in the open source world for ages. So you've been hacking on JBoss and other really, really well-known projects well before Presto. So you definitely know what you're doing.
Well, and what other projects are those? Yeah.
I worked on JBoss back when we used to, like, we would all fit in Mark Fleury's living room. I mean, it was like 10 people.
Who's Mark Fleury? Just so for anybody who's not familiar.
Mark Fleury founded
JBoss
and taught me a lot about what people can do in open source that's not awesome. So I'm glad I don't work with him anymore.
Yeah, he's in Spain now or something, right?
I was happy to see that.
Yeah, so you also worked with Gavin Kingdon, I'm guessing, from the Hibernate team and stuff like that.
Actually, I did not work with Gavin very much. He and I did not get along because Gavin did the I was the container managed persistence guy for. This is like such old news. No one even knows.
I know. I was a bit involved in JBPM with Tom Baines back then.
Yeah. So, but I worked with Sasha, who's I don't know. He's still like the CEO of Cloudbees, right? Last I heard.
So.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we're all showing our age, But
it's only been 20 years now.
Well, that's so good. So what do you do when you don't dive deep in like extremely complicated code bases?
So my number one hobby is coding, which is terrible because people are like, you're a workaholic. But if I'm not coding, I don't know, I'm playing video games or watching sci-fi TV and reading sci-fi books. But I'm kind of a geek, so. And I love coding.
Yeah, you're bad company here. There's no geeks otherwise here.
Yeah. I mean, I truly love coding. Like there was a time where it's like I had plenty of money. I was like, I'm going to go on a break for like, I don't know, a year and figure out what I want to do. And it was like seriously 3 weeks and I was coding. And I was like, okay, whatever. I'm done. I'm giving up. Just get a code.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Were you shaking by the end of those 3 weeks? Just like, oh God, I need it.
It was so awesome to get back into coding. I mean, it's just so much fun.
Yeah.
It's like, I love solving puzzles, and like coding is such an awesome dynamic puzzle, and things change all the time. So
yeah, puzzles. Related to puzzles, I know that whenever I see David, who's going to tell us next what he's up about, that in the background there's always a shelf of board games, and I know you're all into board games as well. And I also spend a lot of time with my kids with board games, so that's definitely something we all share, either even playing together or all as well. So, David, why don't you tell us about your board games and your Trino involvement at the same time?
Yeah, so like everyone else, I've been involved in Trino from the beginning. I did wrote like the CLI and the JDBC driver. I wrote a bunch of the early stuff in the Hive connector. I'd used Hive a bunch previously in like Hadoop, so I'm familiar with like all of the really low-level details of like how do all the Hive file formats work and what are all the weird stuff about like how Hadoop file systems work. So I'm always looking at that stuff or answering user questions about, why do I get this weird behavior here when I do this thing or I have this file format. I wrote the Raptor connector, which is a connector for Presto that stores data natively on Flash and has like its own metadata tracking and has like a bunch of physical optimizations. We used it for some really large scale stuff at Facebook for like really low latency queries for massive applications. It's pretty interesting. And I work on like the build system and like a whole bunch of like random stuff on the edges of Presto and like make sure that like everyone can develop productively. Like I added all the original check style stuff because I was tired of answering comments about like, oh, how do I format this or like things like that like during a code review, I don't really have to deal with that. Like just have it fail automatically and like people get a machine telling them to fix it and then they fix it. Whereas if a human tells them, then they get mad.
Yeah.
So
Awesome.
a lot of like social aspects about like coding that you don't think about when you're just getting started.
That's huge on open source projects too. Like how much time you end up spending just like navigating the icky kind of like, not I say icky, but like the kind of sticky kind of human stuff about it. It's like if you can minimize that and keep people's feelings from being hurt, like that's definitely a win-win.
Yeah, it's kind of weird when you're doing a code review, you start thinking about like, how is this person going to react to this comment? Like, even if this code is bad, I actually have to make them feel good about it while I'm like asking them to change their code. Like that's something when you get started in the industry, like you probably don't think about it. It takes you, at least it took me a long time to internalize that like there's actually a human here, and like I need to think about the human aspect in addition to the technical aspect.
Which is pretty rare for a lot of open source projects too. I feel like I would not say a lot like to do finger pointing or anything, but I've tried a lot of open source before I came to the Presto community, and I had a lot of, I don't know, mean people, let's just say, when I tried to get involved, and I was totally junior dev, and then like they just tore me a new one by saying like, why are you wasting my time, and it's like, okay, like how are you going to grow your community that way? And so that's those words are pretty huge. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that you definitely learn over time. And all of us have been around for a while. And also, I think it helps to have kids because you learn that kids behave similarly. If you just tell them they did it all wrong, it's not going to help.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. One thing that I want to also mention is, and lots of users will love that about David, he writes a lot of documentation and is like the man for the documentation. So if you want to learn anything about the Trino, you will automatically look at the docs, and a lot of that comes from David. So that's awesome.
I would say we would almost not have docs at all if it weren't for David insisting on them. Because I certainly don't think I would have gotten around to writing them.
Yeah, so that's also awesome. Now, those are the three Ning proof point guys. And then there was Eric, who was the first one at Facebook. So tell us more about you, and then how you get to meet these guys and work on Presto and start, and even like where did the name even come from and all kind of stuff. That would be awesome to find out.
Yeah. So I don't know if Martin and Dain remember this, but I actually met them like a year or two before they actually joined Facebook. Do you guys remember that? Mistake in your mind.
I remember that.
Eric's like, so I will treasure that day forever.
So as Manfred mentioned, I've been at Facebook a little bit longer than these guys. I started there in 2010, and I believe I met these guys in 2012. Since the beginning of my time at Facebook, I've always been working in big data, and I've worked on some internal projects. And that's actually why I originally met Martin and Dain, was they were interested in one of the projects we were thinking of open sourcing, but never did. And they came over for a lunch one time, and we chatted about it. And I think they were interested, but also kind of like meh about it. And so I guess that's why we ultimately didn't open source it, because it's largely based on their feedback. But that's my first memory of them. And then when they actually ended up joining, I would say I've worked with people that worked with Dain, David, and Martin in the past, and they had a lot of good things to say about them, and a lot of good respect. And in the short time that they were there, I remember they were probing around looking at different projects to get involved in. And at the time I was working in what was essentially our real-time data streaming infrastructure. And at that time I was looking actually for just something new to latch onto, just to kind of broaden a bit sort of the types of things that I do. And, I heard the whispers on the street that there was some discussion of a new project that was being formed, and I was like, man, I got to get on this, because when you're at a company like Facebook, there's a lot of things that get built and then they just are, right? They they exist because they were there, mm-hmm. right? And it's very few opportunities that you have to see something from scratch, especially at such a big company where you have not just the the use cases to sponsor something, but also like the funding, right? And the sort of you will get the resources if you have the backing, and and then the project will happen. Unlike where you have, you start something in your garage and you have to figure out, oh, how do I get funding? How do I pay myself? That was kind of like I think a really great start. That I felt like, yes, I definitely have to get involved in this. So that's kind of how you would say my involvement with Trino first started. It's been a long ride. I have to admit, it's been a very fun ride too. I have to admit that I did take a short break for a bit. I took a quick hiatus through consumer hardware and AI. So I do have interesting things to say about that, but maybe for another time. But with the recent, let's say, uptick in usage in Trino, it was just like I felt like I really had to get back into this community, and so you'll see me a lot more on the Slack channels and doing pull requests and getting code reviews. I think I'm getting back into the rhythm of being part of this open source community, and I think I am. This is sort of a recent development for me. So as you know, code bases change very quickly. I have been involved since like in the first 6 to 7 years, but I'm just trying to figure out what these guys did to the code base in the last couple of years to make sure there's no like weirdness. It's like, oh, you guys, what happened here, guys?
Yeah, that's always tricky, and especially with a project like Trino that has been accelerating like crazy. Like if you look at the chart of commits, it's going like literally looking like a logarithmic curve at this stage. Yep. I'm not sure how long we're gonna keep that up, but it's amazing. So like from a brief history, basically, you started in what was it 2012 internally at Facebook, and then you open sourced in 2013. So what was then like, how did you come to the name, and why was it even open sourced? Why doesn't this sit in the closet in Facebook? Whose fault is that?
From the very beginning, I want to give credit to Dain, David, and Martin here, because I think from their background, they've had a lot of experience here running open source projects. And I knew from the very beginning that they were insistent that this run with basic open source principles. Now, you guys feel free to jump in too. At Facebook, we kind of had so Facebook does have a somewhat, let's say, checkered history with open source. Like there's a history of producing open source projects, but they tend to be developed internally first, and then open source becomes sort of, something you tack on afterwards. And that's why you get, projects that seem to run well for a bit, and then they kind of start to decay because in the end, if the project hasn't been established with an open source mindset from the beginning, it's very hard for it to continue from both a maintenance and a contribution model, right? You'll see things like this with, Scribe and Cassandra. These are things that were open sourced, and then they just kind of, the community took it over, right? Because, it's hard for Facebook to maintain that the right level of involvement. But I think keeping it from the beginning, that's really what differentiated this project from a lot of those other projects. And I think that really set a standard for some of the other future open source projects at Facebook. And you asked about the naming. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say we built it from the beginning to be open source. That was part of as we were talking with people about what we were going to be doing. When the idea came up about building what would eventually become Presto, we said, okay, but we want that to be open source, and we negotiated that all the way with engineering leadership, and they were on board with that. And you can see, for example, Facebook uses internal source control systems, internal code review systems are not what regular open source projects use. We started with all the open source tools. We started on GitHub. You can actually go see the first commit that we had on the repository. We started with code reviews using GitHub with Git as a Git workflows. And then when we eventually made it open source, it was just a matter of tying some loose ends in terms of cleaning up a few things, adding documentation, making the website, and then just clicking a button, and then the project was open source. There was no much more ceremony than that. So
I have this memory, and I believe it was David, but it might have been you also, Martin, that like from the moment we started, it's like, okay, we're doing GitHub, but every commit that we're putting in, we're going to expose that. It isn't going to be like, oh, we get to like when we open source it, we just squash everything into one initial commit. It's like, no, we want to show them the history from like the moment that we created this project. And so that really set a tone of like, one, you're producing code that you want everyone to see externally, and the history and how it developed, and like actually, if you go back and look at that, we wrote like a whole different design of Presto and threw it away because it didn't actually work. It took us like 3 months to build it, and then we threw it in the trash. And we never really integrated any direct Facebook stuff into it because like we wanted this to be open and clean. And so it was from the very first moment. I remember like the insistence, like, no, this stuff will be public at one day. So be aware.
Yeah, that's very hard to do. I've done open source projects like Concord and stuff like that. And it's not easy to get that sort of like level of quality going in internal projects from the start. So heads off for that. So when in that time from like when you started committing code and open sourcing in 2013, did you come up with the name, and who was that? Some sort of like Argentinian influence there with the Presto, or where did it come from?
No, we're trying to come up with a name, and I mean we're all pretty terrible at picking names, so we couldn't come up with anything. And then over the weekend, our manager came back and said, "Okay, I picked a name. It's gonna be Presto." It's like, okay, sounds good.
No. He came back and was like, "I think we should go with this." He's like, and we're all like, "This is the worst name ever. It's terrible."
Yeah, we had no other.
We went on and on. No. And then like we all went home, and I remember we came back the next day, and we're all like, "You know what? That name's actually pretty good." That was my memories. We all hated it. We all slept on it. We're like, no, this is actually pretty good.
There's like a psychological effect of like how often you get exposed to something. Like if you keep getting exposed to it, like if you hear a song on the radio and you hate it at first, and then you just keep hearing that song over again, eventually you just kind of start to like it just because you know it. I think that's kind of with any name.
Now the interesting about the name is that I mean people think about, especially people here in the U.S. They look at they hear Presto and they immediately think magic, because like Presto, magic trick or whatever. And the name had nothing to do with magic when we came out with it. I mean, Presto means soon in Italian, and it was meant to convey a sense of speed, of immediacy, and so on. So the association with magic is something that people made up later. It was not the original intent.
Yeah, we were. That was actually one of the things I remember not liking about the name, because I and Martine and David have a lot of experience working with code that is magic, and you have no idea what's going on, and we hate it.
Yeah.
So it's like every time code feels like magic, you're like, this is designed wrong. No magic. Like it needs to be obvious and completely straightforward. So we're like, we don't want to be the magic sequel. It's like, no, we could be fast, but never magic.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Because it was sort of like towards fast, because Presto also needs sort of fast, and now it's even faster because we're using Trino. So where does Trino come from?
Oh, Trino.
I know, but I'm not going to let you tell us.
Yeah. I was saying. So, well, I mean, it was a couple weeks ago. Actually, over the past couple months, we were
drinking.
Yeah, we were drinking. Yeah. No, we've been thinking about names for a while. I mean, there's all these discussions we've been having with the Linux Foundation about the name. We've been thinking about names for at least a couple months. We had a couple candidates. They were okay, but not great, and of course they weren't very appropriate for resolving the confusion between the two names and so on. So I think it was like a week before Christmas or something like that. We went back to brainstorming names, and we started throwing names around, and at some point we got to the point of let's I know we started throwing names of physical particles or some concepts like that. And one of the ones that came up was the word neutrino. Neutrinos are lightweight, they're fast, so that came up. But the problem is that neutrino is not an easy word. Like it's hard to pronounce. It's if you say it, like some people might get confused about how it's actually spelled. It's hard to market. I mean, you search for neutrino, there's so many things called neutrino.
Yeah, there are a million things named neutrino.
Yeah. You can't get a domain name, like that domain name is taken. And then I know it occurred to me, well, maybe we can shorten it and just remove the first three letters. And that's the Trino came up and everyone sort of liked it. And I mean, there was no other, we didn't have any better choices. So that kind of stuck around.
So before we're
No
kind
way.
of, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I remember like, it was like immediately once I heard it, I was like, oh, this is it. This is like, I mean, you look at names, we literally looked at thousands and thousands of names and nothing strikes you. And it's just shocking when you actually find something you like. So it was, I was super, super happy. And I immediately started messaging people.
Yeah. And then of course, I mean, the first thing we did was let's see if we can, if the domain is available, if we can get, like, let's see what the presence is on Twitter, on Slack, on basically all the social media properties. And I was like, okay, it seems like we can do something with this name, and we went with it.
Awesome. Real fast, I want to quickly rewind to just kind of do a fast, overview of like, so 2012 is when Presto at the time started, and then 2013 it gets open sourced. 2018 we have the exit, or sorry, 2019. That's the year. Martine, Dain, and David leave Facebook. Could you guys talk a little bit about that portion and kind of what made you decide to leave Facebook? Because I think we got a little bit ahead of ourselves jumping right into the Trino name, but we'll get there.
I mean, that was it was end of 2018. Dain, do you want to talk about it, or do you want me to talk about it?
I mean, I could talk about it. You jump in. Like, I mean, so as this has a lot to do with like Facebook internal politics. So in the beginning, Presto was really used as like, it was a new thing. It was just an add-on thing to what was already existing there. And it worked really well. Everyone was super happy. But we were isolated to just basically high performance analytics over the main warehouse. We could do this federation. We had these, a couple of additional use cases. As things grew and Presto became more and more and more important to the company. Like, it runs the entire A/B testing system for like new features into the company. It's a ginormous use case with like tens of thousands of machines. And then we started to replace all the batch processing with Presto. The importance of the project became more and more important, and there was more and more pressure to, there were more people who wanted to be involved with that very important project at the company. And it became very political. And some of those people decided that they wanted to have more control over the open source part of the project, to direct it like was being done with like, so in the analytics part of Facebook, all of the other things that Facebook works with are forked. There's forked versions of Spark. They forked Spark like 4 years ago now. They forked Hive, which like they created, like every single project is forked and custom. And there's people who just work on the forked version, and there's really no one working on the open source stuff. And we were the outlier. And it wasn't that we're doing this important new great thing. The people who believed that weren't actually involved in the data analytics anymore. It was, well, why are you different? Why aren't you working like the other projects? And so there came this point where the pressure was to switch the project so that it was 100% under control of the Facebook engineering. And that culminated with the idea that anyone who was on the Presto team at Facebook immediately became a committer, which is what the Presto project calls people who can merge stuff into the code base. I fought against it for months and months. I mean, I literally sat down with the management team and said, this is exactly what will happen when you guys make this decision. Like, the community is going to fork. No one's going to want to work with you. You're going to be on your own. Like, people will walk away. Like, I've seen this before. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that, like, actually I would be the person doing that. But I assure you, I explained everything that would happen, even almost up to the point where we're at now, explained that to them 3-4 months before Facebook made this decision. It's not like they were naive about it. And I showed up one day and Facebook, there was a slide deck that was going to be presented saying, here's the decision the management team made. No communication to the community, no sign off from any of us. And I quit the next day. So that was it.
Man.
Wow, that must have been a tough decision.
Oh no, it's a super easy decision.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me that it was an easy decision for you, Dain. Just like, yeah,
I mean, there are decisions that are hard. Sometimes people make it super easy for you.
Yeah,
like
inevitable.
It's so anti-community. It's so everything I believed in that it was the easiest decision.
Yeah,
like, you know,
and
not a problem.
Martine and David were right behind you, or did it take a couple days for that to propagate through? Were you guys pretty much like all leaving pretty much the same time, and you just decided you were going to fork it, or
they left pretty much right after me. I mean, not the exact same day, but yeah, they were very much right behind. Followed by
everyone.
A lot of people don't know the rest of the Facebook engineering team, but many of people left that team, including the vast majority of the management team that made this decision. They're all gone. So roundly a disaster for everyone.
I mean, we've been involved in the project from the beginning. We helped build the community. We helped establish the norms of how the project is run, how the community engages. And that was like it was like trying to switch or overnight change the way those dynamics worked wasn't. We didn't feel it was conducive to a healthy open source community. So it was 100% against everything we thought should be done for an open source community. So and we care a lot about that. So we ended up.
Well, and the good thing is you cared so much that you carried on. So
Yeah.
you started the Presto Software Foundation, Presto SQL, and the project actually didn't slow down at all. On the contrary, like it accelerated like crazy, right? Like even like just looking at what happened in the last year, 2020, me and Martina working and Brian are working towards a blog post of like new stuff, and it's ridiculous, like so many new connectors and so much stuff. So what happened that now we have Trino?
Well, I was going to say, like, after we left, I was completely blown away by the response of the community. Like, you know, there's a thing where you're like, I have my morals. This is what I'm doing. I think people will be with you. But to see the response, and it was like much more than I had ever imagined. Like the responses we got from all the other groups involved in, and how excited they were for just a change in the project of not being a Facebook project. Maybe Martine can tell some more parts of this story as we went around and met with everyone.
I mean, they were. When we set up the foundation, we said, well, we left Facebook and we said, okay, we need to do something about this. Like, Presto needs to continue. And we had this idea of okay, maybe we have to. Maybe we can go move it to some of the existing foundations or set up something by ourselves. We ended up selling on setting up a dedicated foundation for the project. So we went around and talked to a lot of people, talked to all the people that were involved in the project, like the biggest users, the biggest contributors. We even talked to Facebook at the time, and everyone was super positive. Like there were even some of the people saying, "Oh, it's about time you did this." Like we were worried about the future of the project if it remained as a project controlled exclusively by Facebook. So it was a very positive response, and it kind of, it gave us, like, I know, it's like it validated what we were thinking of. Okay, this is a good move. This is what we have to do.
Awesome. Okay. So then now things progress, like, right? So this is early 2019. Now what was initially called Presto SQL. right? I think a lingering question that I've heard a lot from the community is why Presto SQL versus just maybe making it something like Trino? Were you afraid if you strayed from the name, it was going to be confusing, or did you foresee any issue with using Presto SQL and continuing with Presto? Why was the name chosen for Presto SQL in particular?
Well, so we actually didn't pick the name. Presto SQL is just the social media handle, if you want to call it some way. I mean, the name of the project was Presto.
Right.
The way we saw it at the time, and based on all the signals from Facebook management, was that Facebook wasn't actually interested in continuing to maintain an open source project. So we said, okay, this is the project. This is Presto. This is the community. So it's going to continue to be called Presto. Effectively, the way we saw it at the time was the whole community is just moving on, right? And eventually, because of what Facebook was doing, we thought, well, they would continue to work internally on their version, and that was it. So it's like I think at the time we call it Presto graduated from Facebook. We actually use that phrase in a couple places.
Yeah.
So we didn't see the reason for changing the name. I mean, it was the same project, the same community, the same people that were involved. It's just in a different home, if you will. Like,
right.
Sure. In a GitHub. Yeah.
I'd say I don't think it was just like wishful thinking on our part. Like there was a lot of evidence to go with it. Like we set up a new Slack, and the Slack filled up with all the people who are working on it, and like the one that was being used by Facebook completely emptied out. Like there was zero traffic. There'd be, a message a week or something like that. We saw huge pickup in the PRs against the project. So it was clear that the community had consolidated around this project, and like there was almost no like contact with Facebook. Like they weren't really saying anything. So like it was, to us, it had looked like, okay, well, the community moved on. Facebook will go proprietary like they had done with really every other project they were running internally.
So plot twist, that didn't happen. Now we have, PrestoDB kind of gets picked back up, and we're not going to go into too much details about them, but now we kind of have a competing open source project, and they can you tell us a little bit about, just not necessarily about the community over there, but more about, there was I guess a Linux Foundation that was a competing Linux Foundation to Presto Software Foundation, and that one was called Presto Foundation. I guess, and kind of how that drove us to now Trino. I think that's now we're closing the loop here.
Also the timing, right? Like that happened later, right? Like the Presto Software Foundation was founded in 2019, and then everything was just fine for a while, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, Facebook decided to change their position in terms of whether or how they wanted to run the project. So they eventually ended up deciding to donate the project to the Linux Foundation, which is, I mean, that created, or that would result in a completely different dynamics than what they wanted to achieve when they made a decision that caused us to leave. Right, it was a complete reversal of what was going on. So, and then of course, like once the project became part of Linux Foundation, and the Linux Foundation got a trademark associated with the project that Facebook had registered a few months after we left. I mean, it's part of Linux Foundation's job to take care of trademarks and so on. And we've been talking to them about this issue of naming for some time, and eventually, like end of 2020, we came to a conclusion where we had to change the name. There was no other way to solve this problem.
Sorry, you go, Brian.
One quick like loop back question is I've always wanted to know this myself. This is my own question. I am not pulling this from the community. At what point did you guys kind of get the feeling like Presto and now Trino was like actually going to be a project that spanned decades? David has a really cool quote talking about how you guys are trying to model this now like Postgres and trying to get this to span decades and just be this longevitous project. And so I'm just curious to kind of get, and actually I'm going to pick on David because I never hear him talk enough. So David, like what point did you kind of like feel, hey, this is Presto or eventually now what's going to be Trino is going to be like this decades long project and people are going to be using this in 10, 20, 30 years?
It's hard to say when I like actually knew that was going to be true. I think like from very early on, like that was something we thought about. Like we always thought about like, you build a database system, like once people start using a database, like they kind of get locked in, like even if they don't try to, just like you build so much stuff on top of it that it's very hard to move off. So like anytime we had like SQL features or functions, like we think that this is going to be a permanent feature. So like you make sure you get it right. Cause like once you put it in, people are going to rely on it. You can't go and change it. Mm-hmm. So, and you look at pretty much any database system and like they live for years or decades. So we always kind of kept that in mind that like, if this project lives for decades, right? Like, are we making a decision that is going to help that? Or like, are people going to be like cursing at us like 10 years from now that we made this stupid decision?
Right.
But I probably around, I don't know, 2016, 17, like it got started to get popular. But it wasn't until probably a couple of years ago that the growth like really took off. And like, I mean, it surprised us. And I think it kind of still surprises us to this day that like how many people use it and like how big the community is, that like, you just never think that something you work on is going to become that popular.
Yeah. It's incredible. I think that's like one of the feats that any software engineer wants to achieve, right? It's like so cool. Were you going to say something, Dain?
I actually have a question for Eric on this, because I clearly remember when we were setting up this project at Facebook, David and I think Martine were talking about like, hey, we need to build this and we need to build for a like 10, 20 year horizon. And we talked about this out loud. And we're at a company, Facebook, who've been around for 5 years at this point. And like a 20-year horizon at Facebook is like, a 5-year-old talking about like, oh, when I'm 35, I'm going to be doing X. It's just like you have no idea of how far out that is. And so like, I'm curious what he thought about us talking about these long time horizons and like what other people did. Were they like, these guys are insane? Like, or were they like, they think that was cool. Like, I'm just curious how everyone else thought about it.
No, it's interesting. I think that's definitely I think the long-term planning is one of those ideals that are talked about a lot everywhere, actually. But it's rare that you get to see it lived out, right? Because in practice, what happens is you talk about all these grand visions, and then once you get that first iteration out, pressures from product, pressures from, supporting existing customers, all of these things start to press in on you. And then you start to take compromises here and there just to get things out faster. And then that's the kind of stuff that builds up over time. And at Facebook, that's actually one of the inherent problems is that it's a result of competing pressures to try to continue to deliver impact on certain projects. And sometimes when you have to plan out for these 5-10 year horizons, you're taking short-term or even midterm trade-offs in terms of what you can deliver in that period of time. And so to become successful at achieving or even realistically moving towards this ideal, you have to be willing to make plans that span more than 6 months, right? 6 months, a year, even 2 years, right? That's the type of planning and commitment that it takes. And it's something that's really hard when you have an environment that is really focused on, say, six month intervals.
Good. Yeah, very, very, very cool. Did any of you have an inkling, like when you were starting the project, that this could be big, or like that this could be something that would go beyond? Like, did you kind of see this as a maybe it'll happen and that's the goal? But like, I'm just curious if you had, like, if you could have seen this today, like, would you, and you could go back and tell yourself, like, would you have like smacked yourself over the head? No way that's going to happen. Or would you have believed yourself?
I mean, I think there was certainly a hope. I mean, we were trying to build something, we were trying to make it open source, and we were hoping that it would eventually become something that could, I know, compete with commercial systems. Like, and we David in particular had used some, and they had used some commercial data warehouse systems. So that was kind of like the North Star. Is like, oh, if we can build something that can compete with those systems, and is as usable and popular as those systems, then we succeeded. But I don't think we knew that was going to happen. It's like it was more of a desire and hope that eventually we would get there.
Yeah, makes sense.
I was pretty confident that we would build a successful open source project that was really big, that a lot of people used. I mean, I'd worked on JBoss. I'd seen it done before. And up until, like, you know, after we left Facebook and the way the community went, like, absolutely, I could see that. The last year and a half, as I would have never believed that back then. Like, the size of the expansiveness and the use of Presto across the world in the largest companies. Like, you know, we built a database. It was very popular in the Valley. It was open source, right? And then you see, like, some of the largest companies in the world who are very conservative using Presto, and it being used throughout the world. Like, when we left Facebook, we started looking at the traffic. We're like, why does like a quarter of the traffic come from China and Japan and Europe? And we're like, we thought it was like everyone was just Valley people. And we're like, we went and did all these conferences around the world, and we're like, this is crazy. Like, we live in a bubble, and the bubble has popped, and it was awesome.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. That's cool.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So now we have the Trino name. We did that refactoring. So there's people asking about, how do you actually make that happen? Like, what are some of the tips and tricks you have? Maybe, I know David, for example, did a whole bunch of like package refactoring and all that kind of jazz. How do you make that happen? Like, did you like have to queue it all up and then with one bang do like massive change commits or whatever? Or like, what tools did you use? Do you have some tricks there? People are curious, because obviously that happens in like commercial applications, internal, and lots of people have that problem. So you've done it twice now. So what tricks do you have?
Well, so the first time was a lot easier because it was still called Presto. Like, the first time we were just changing like package names and like Maven coordinates. This time we're changing the entire branding of the project. You know, like the name Presto was ingrained like for, 8 years, like it was called Presto. So that's just everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
If you look, there's probably about 30 commits between 350 and 351 that did the rename. For like the actual, the bulk of like the code changes, like changing the module name, changing the package names, there's just a sequence of 5 commits. They're actually called like step 1 of 5, step 2 of 5. That I did that with like mostly command line tools like find and sed and grep, and like making sure that those works correctly. The goal there was so that when Git would understand what happened. So like the first commit is it just moves the code. So it just moves the files in the file system so that the files are 100% identical. There are 0 content changes. So Git sees that, oh, this file is renamed from here to here to here. Whereas if you did like a normal kind of Java refactoring, like, okay, I move the code, it updates the imports, updates the package statements. For a lot of files, like that's going to be very significant, and then Git like will treat it as like a copy, or it'll treat it as like 2 different files, and it won't understand the history. So we were careful to sequence those so that Git would be able to understand that, and we knew that had worked on some previous renames or projects. We've done that technique.
That's awesome.
The other,
so just that,
the other
just
techniques we just did.
Just to clarify, David,
refactoring.
Does that mean when you're just moving the files, it basically didn't compile at that stage? Right? Because
so normally, like our rule is like every commit has to compile, has to pass all the CI tests, which you want to do that so that like you can go and find out, like if you introduced a bug, you want to be able to like run the test and see like exactly which commit did that. So, but this change was like an exception to that, because just due to the technical requirements of like if you moved and if it compiled at every step, like Git wouldn't understand what happened, and Like
That's
that
awesome.
would be worse.
That's a great trick.
Yeah, but in general, yeah, every commit has to like compile and pass all the tests. And so like we renamed Presto exception to Trino exception. I just did that with IntelliJ refactoring.
Cool.
And there's a nice trick actually that IntelliJ, if you commit from IntelliJ, the commit box that pops up, there's an option to optimize the imports for the files that have changed. Because unfortunately, IntelliJ, like optimizing imports is very expensive. So like if you do like a move, they don't optimize the imports. And so like your moved class, if it's in a different order in the imports, it'll be wrong. But if you commit with IntelliJ, it'll optimize the imports for all the files you changed.
Oh, very cool.
That's
Very
awesome.
cool.
So you had these 5 steps that did all these things, and then you were basically in business again.
Well, and then a whole bunch of other commits actually like update the documentation,
Yeah.
rename like the Docker image, like rename the CLI, like a whole bunch of like stuff. And then there's actually more commits coming in because we didn't get everything internally. But
And
I mean,
there,
you're also leaving off the 10 other repos you had to do this in.
oh yeah, because the Presto project has a number of dependencies. Like we
That's
have
true.
a shaded build of Hive that had to be updated and released as well.
wow. So there was also another change that people are aware of, and I thought was really cool, is that you kind of nested and condensed down the first level of Trino now. And so, can you talk a little bit about that decision? I mean, is this something that has been long on the waiting list? And since we're already kind of breaking it, might as well just fix it, right?
Yeah, that's something Martine had wanted to do for a while. And then like Dain and I, before we did the rename, we're like, all right, we got to do it now. Like this is the only time we're ever going to be able to do this. So
Yep.
we kind of settled on a philosophy that like, we don't want to have any modules at the top level with the exception of the documentation, because documentation is kind of special. So everything has to fit into a subfolder. And then we said, we want to kind of minimize the number of things at the top level. We want to make them categorical, but more like conceptual and not like purely technical.
Mm-hmm.
So like we have plugins and libraries, and it's like, well, some of the things in plugins are not technically a plugin, but like they're logically a plugin. So we put them there because that's what people would expect.
Gotcha.
So we just kind of came up with the categorization. We ran it past some people, and
we've seen this for a while now as Presto grew, and it was just a few modules. Now I think it's 40, 50 modules. You get lost, and new users get really lost. And so like, they're like, where's the main code? And we're like, okay, here's the core package. And then you go in there and there's only a few things. And so like, it kind of helps conceptually narrow people down. Or if they're like, hey, I'm interested in writing a plugin, they can go look exclusively at plugins.
Yep.
Whereas like before it was just really hard to deal with.
So much more lucid
for a new user.
Yeah. And it's just faster for navigation too. Not even for people that are just constantly working in it. It's just easier to find things and group things as well. So I like the grouping a lot, and definitely check it out if you haven't seen it yet. So let's get to the thing that everybody really wants to know. Where the heck did the bunny come from? Does anybody want to answer that?
So
we have, go ahead, Martin.
No, I was going to say, like, we're talking about names like for the past couple of months, and one of the names we settled on was related to magic. And so we have a designer that has been helping us. I mean, she helped us with the rebrand of the website back when we created Presto SQL, and then she's been helping with a new website and the new design, and she's awesome, and she's super creative, and she came up with this idea of this bunny, and I made the space theme and the bunny in the space suit and all that, and we all loved it. I mean, it was great. So we said, okay, even we're gonna go with a different name. With Trino, we're keeping the bunny.
Yeah, that was Alison Lonely. Thanks for that, by the way. Big shout out. She's getting a lot of love online, and people want plushies and stickers and all sorts of stuff like that. So
yeah,
I can't wait. And I love that we now have a logo that isn't like abstract, that we can do new things with over time, and like it's a lot more personable. Like I feel like the brand has actually changed from this abstract kind of cold technical thing to something that's been more personable.
Yeah.
And like, I actually really feel that's the way we've gone with the community since we've split off, is that like everyone's much more engaged at like an open source kind of natural level. And like, you know, we're all there and personable, and this is really approachable. And you could see that through like the directory redesign we just talked about. And I'm super happy. Like,
yeah, related
awesome.
to that, I wanted to also mention we are calling it the bunny for now. We are going to look for a name for the bunny, and what we're going to do is we're going to open up a thread on Slack to take suggestions for names, collect them for a while, and then launch some sort of like sub-selection and let the community help us decide what the name of the bunny should be, because obviously it can't just always be the bunny.
Yep.
We need a backstory also. Someone needs to write the history of the bunny.
I think we can work on that too.
I've proposed the alien theme since we're in space as well. I think the bunny should have superpowers, but that's just me. You know, obviously we'll open this up to the floor. But anyways, that's my 2 cents on Bunny's backstory. I think Clark Kent kind of bunny style.
So another thing that I wanted to talk about quickly is also like we have 351 now. After all this refactoring, you got a 351 release out that is fully functional and obviously has a few wrinkles yet. So can you maybe talk about what's next? Like what are some things that you know we still need to do, and what are things that people need to do? Like we wrote a great blog post, David wrote a great blog post about migrating and what you have to do in order to change, which is actually not too hard at all. But what are some other things people have to be prepared on, what they should know?
I think we covered it pretty well in the blog post. Like our goal for the 351 release is that all the breaking changes, like package changes, protocol changes, JDBC driver changes, all of that, like all the user-facing stuff was in the 351 release, so that like we know that there's going to be pain to migrate, but like everything should be done in 351. So there shouldn't be any more of those like breaking changes after that. Like everything you see as a user, it should say Trino everywhere in 351.
Yeah, also like related to that, for example, like the pain is not that big at all, actually, in my opinion. Like most people that are like analysts or so that are connected to a Presto / a Trino cluster now, the only thing they potentially need to change is the connection string in their tool, like the JDBC connection string or whatever. And then it's the same. The SQL, the catalog names, all of that stuff is going to be completely working just fine. So the only people that have to deal with a little bit more change is the people that operate the cluster. And even that's not too bad, I think. So I think it's really amazing what you did.
Yeah.
Yeah, we worked really hard to mitigate the migration pain. And if you are running a cluster, absolutely read the blog post. If you have any other questions, like definitely ask them. As we get feedback, we'll work on updating the blog posts and other advice.
Related to that, also what we did is that blog post is going to be part of the docs. We're working on that already, so we're going to keep refreshing it, so it's going to be easy to find for everyone. So go to the blog for now, but also look forward to having that in the documentation as well. So that's awesome. Thank you, David.
And that's a great point to reiterate, Manfred, is that for end users, there should be no changes. Like all your SQL, everything still works. Like you'll see a different name in the stack trace, but and like the error message will say Trino now, but otherwise like nothing breaks for end users.
So one other thing, and this is getting back to like a more sticky kind of human problem, is a lot of engineers and maybe even kind of at the data analyst level are gonna maybe have to explain, hey, it's now called Trino, and so sometimes this is just a small implementation detail, but then once it becomes a new thing, so now we've totally diverged into calling ourselves something totally different from Presto. If somebody were to come up to you and say, okay, I need to pitch this to my boss or somebody and basically tell them what are the features in Trino that I should be like, that means we should be using Trino and not Presto, and kind of what would you tell that person or that user?
Well, I think the list is huge. I mean, if you want a summary, we actually wrote a blog post last year at the end of 2019, a couple years ago, end of 2019, summarizing all the changes that happened in what was Presto SQL at the time, effectively Trino, during that year, and we're working on a new blog post for this year. So that has a summary of all the changes, and it's not exhaustive. I mean, that's only the tip of the iceberg, and all those changes are, or almost all of the changes are exclusive to Trino. And I say almost because Presto has been backporting some changes from Trino to Presto over the past couple of years, but the majority are exclusive to Trino, and you'll see a difference. It's like it's pretty stark. I mean, there are a couple of off the top of my head, if I had to mention some, like for example, last year we added support for variable precision times datetime types. That was a massive change. Anyone that's dealing with time data, and for example in the financial industry, like they typically need precision higher than milliseconds, and that's a feature that only Trino has. It's a big change. So I wouldn't expect any other branches or forks of Presto to be able to implement that in the near term future. There are tons of performance improvements, language improvements. Like there's a lot of work with it to get the language closer to what the ANSI specification says. For example, one of the things that happened last year, we fixed the semantics of timestamps. Timestamps have been broken for many years in Presto, and we finally fixed them to comply with what the SQL specification says. So it'll be a big difference. So if you come from other databases like I know Vertica, Teradata, Oracle, Postgres, and you're used to those semantics, then now Presto behaves in the same way. I know, Dain, David, are there any other big improvements you can think of? So sorry, one thing: support for asset tables in Hive. Yep. And Hive, or recent versions of Hive have support for transactional tables, and now Presto can operate against them. You can read them, you can insert into them, delete from them, and that's only a change that exists in Trino.
A question about that also related to that. Isn't the Coral support that you worked on with LinkedIn also exclusive to Trino, which is great for migrating, right? Like if you have any Hive views or legacy setup in Hive that has lots of Hive views, the Coral support, or like usage of the Coral library to support Hive views natively in Trino also is exclusive, right? Like that's.
Yeah, absolutely. We work with that team at LinkedIn very closely, and the idea is to. We want to make Trino support views, Hive views, which are defined using the Hive syntax natively, because people are running Hive installations, may rely on them heavily, and being able to have a seamless experience is important. So we work with that team very closely. They use that feature very extensively at LinkedIn, and we finally got it integrated late last year.
I also would like to mention just a couple like connectors if you guys want to riff on that for a bit. There's a lot of connectors that I would say a huge multitude, but like at least a nice little handful.
Like Prometheus,
Iceberg,
Elasticsearch.
Yeah, Iceberg's a pretty promising one, I think.
Iceberg,
yeah. So.
Yeah, Martin mentioned like delete for Hive Acid. We're coming out with merge and update as well.
Cool.
In the next couple months for Hive Acid, and then we'll be implementing that for Iceberg.
Yeah, we just had DJ.
Iceberg is huge. Like I think it's the future format of choice for like cloud data warehouses because it's from Netflix originally. It's an Apache project. Like it's just such a better like way to store and manage metadata for tables that like just works really well with cloud storage systems.
Yeah. You can think of it as a way to organize your data into your object store. So Hive uses directories that have certain meanings and a meta store. Iceberg is a different way of organizing that data and collecting stats and things like that. That's just based on all of the things that were discovered over the past 10 years of Hive, of like, someone created an organization, you figure out all the problems. Like I think the Hive stuff maybe even predates Cloud Object Store and like the problems that were created there. And so Iceberg is just, it's like solves all those problems. It's super exciting.
And Trino allows you to actually migrate, right? Like you could easily hook up a Hive connector and an Iceberg connector and do a create table as statement from one to the other. And Bob's your uncle, everything is migrated and you can continue using your same data in now an Iceberg storage, right?
Yes. Yeah. And we're about to land a feature that LinkedIn's been working on that it's completely transparent where you can use like the Hive or the Iceberg catalog and have tables from either one and it'll work basically transparently for end users.
Wow.
So you can do a migration table at a time. Because the problem is once you have more than like 10 tables, you just don't have the option of like, I'll shut everything down for 2 months and rewrite all the data. Like that's not going to happen.
Yeah. So that's a good avenue to talk about next. So what is next? Like Trino is obviously rocking and is going to continue rocking. I know there's a couple of things already on the Hive line. You mentioned the update. What are some other things you know that are coming down the pipe in the next couple of releases?
Well, I mean, next couple of releases, you have to go look at the open pull requests. I mean, we release every 2 weeks, so there's only so much time we have to be able to build anything for a couple of releases. No, but in terms of big projects that are coming up, so there's update merge that David mentioned. There's people working on adding support for some language features like the window clause. We're starting to look at match recognize as a new feature. It's a big feature in SQL 2016. Improvements in support for correlated subqueries. I mean, Presto supports them, but there are some edge cases that it doesn't, and we keep expanding the support there. There's been an ongoing effort to revamp the way functions are implemented or managed inside Trino, and that's ongoing. It's going to happen hopefully soon. We're gonna finish that soon, and with that we'll be able to start having more advanced features, like for example, users defining functions on the fly, or support for polymorphic table functions. I mean, we haven't started working on that yet, but it's something that's on the horizon now that all this functional work is happening. I know there are people that are starting to focus on performance improvements, like dedicated efforts to improve performance, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. So we expect to see some boost in performance over the next few months. And related to that, we're working on a new implementation of the reader for Parquet. So Parquet is fast, but it's not as fast as the org implementation that Dain was talking about earlier. There's an entire layer of the reader that is not very optimal, so we're working on revamping that whole thing. So hopefully the performance will eventually be similar to what the org performance is in Trino right now.
So Dain, do you have your fingers in that again?
Martin's doing that one. I helped out with some very, very, very low level algorithms, but Martin's been doing most of the work.
Awesome.
Nice. Okay, well, with that, Manfred, did you have any other questions? I think that was all of them, right?
I think we got lots sorted out today, and I think it was great. And there will always be more questions related to that. Of course, we are collecting questions, and who knows, we might have to pull you guys back in again. Martin is already a second time at least here, so be prepared for us to rip you into here again. Or also anyone else who wants to join us in a future episode. We are live pretty regularly, and we're always ready to have questions that come towards us being answered. And I'm sure Trino is going to be going forward, continuing with a lot of exciting developments, and obviously we'll be talking about them. So I think we're good.
I'd like to finish the show. We got in the chat just a quick mention that from Nick saying, "I love this story so much. It shows how much you care about open source, and it's a role model to follow." So thank you, Nick, for writing that in. And other than that, I think we're pretty good now. Oh, wait, we got one more. Thanks, everybody. Really interesting and insightful hearing the Trino story. So thanks, everyone, for who's listening in live. And thanks, Martin, Dain, David, Eric, for joining us today. It was an awesome, awesome show. Hope that everybody got to learn a lot more about the story than we've been able to get them privy to beforehand. And yeah, definitely, hopefully see you guys in a couple weeks or months.
or join us on Slack, obviously, Trino.io and trino2b.slack.com is where we're at. We're all there. All day, every day, pretty much.
And last little bit, music for the show is from the Mega Man 6 gameplay album by Krzysztof Slowakowski. So thank you all. Have a great one.